So financial investments in aviation is our topic, and I have to admit at the beginning of the year, I was pretty flabbergasted how quickly things can change. We had the start of the pandemic, and here in Germany, where I sit, the largest airline, that's Deutsche Lufthansa, they said, well, yes, it looks like no revenue's coming in, but we're cool. We have about 10 billion euros worth of unencumbered aircraft, and if push comes to shove, we'll just sell some. It turned out they couldn't sell any, and now they're sitting there with one of the biggest government bailouts that they have to pay back over the next couple of years. And so we did see dramatic things happening in Europe. How did it change your industry? That's what I'm going to ask Michael Menhart, Global Chief Economist at Munich Re, and Joseph McGinley, Head of Investor Relations at AerCap. I hope you can hear me, and let's start with Michael on that first question.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Indeed, the environment has changed a lot over the year. However, in our view, in my view, the long-term perspective has not changed that much. The key trends that we see in the mobility industry overall, in the aviation industry in particular, they are still valid and they are still there. And those trends are, first of all, that mobility needs increase with economic growth. That's a long-term perspective that has been there for years and decades. And I believe this is something that we are also going to see in the future. And the current coronavirus crisis was, of course, a major setback, but it has not changed our overall view on that. The second really big trend, and that's something that you have just been discussing quite intensively, is of course the question of climate mitigation. Mobility needs will further increase, but there will be a massive competition between the different suppliers of mobility, and aviation and others will only succeed there if they also fulfill the increasing needs regarding climate mitigation and carbon neutrality.
But I would still think, given the problems that airlines face, some have folded already, some are heavily struggling, winter is coming, so to say. I wonder, did residual value of aviation assets, didn't they collapse? I understand at a time there weren't really any prices set, and is that something that we will see happening with all the airlines that may fail? Are we facing a flood of aircraft that nobody wants? Joseph?
It's a good question, and it's something that we at AerCap, as the largest owner of commercial aircraft in the world, take very seriously. And fundamentally, it comes down to one thing: do more people want to travel each year? And what we have seen so far in the response to COVID is that when people are allowed to travel, they will travel. And so, like the financial crisis, when people thought that the banking models were changed forever, and like after prior crises, 9/11 or the Gulf War, where travel was impacted, again, travel came back very quickly afterwards. We saw that in Europe during the summertime when the quarantine restrictions were lifted, albeit the reverse has happened since then. So our long-term fundamental thesis is that air travel will remain something that people want to aspire to and something that is necessary for business investment. So with that as the backdrop, surely you will have dislocations and interruptions in pricing. But by the same token, there are very few transactions taking place at the moment on the aviation side. Anyone who is selling aircraft at the moment is doing so from a position of distress, and anyone who is buying aircraft at the moment is doing so purely on an opportunistic basis. Because there are uncertainties abound at the moment, it is clear that we must have a long-term view in order to take the long-term value approach for aircraft. Our view is that aviation will bounce back quickly. Clearly, the news in the last number of weeks on a vaccine will help accelerate that. But the residual values that you have mentioned, we believe remain strong. The one exception to that, however, is that current technology aircraft, that is the aircraft of the previous generation, certainly will find it more difficult on a valuation perspective going forward. And we believe that the shift to new technology aircraft is only being accelerated by the impact of COVID. 12% of the world's fleet is in new technology aircraft. We have around 65% of our fleet in new technology aircraft. And the demand for those aircraft, even from airlines that are going through bankruptcy proceedings at the moment, is that they want to keep those aircraft. Those airlines want to stick around. They want to renegotiate their debts and leases. But fundamentally, they want those aircraft for the future. And that is what we will build our fleet around.
I agree with you on a lot of things. Two of them are a lot of airlines will probably restructure their debt. And also, when my kids are grown up, COVID will not be the most important or the biggest thing in aviation. But I do believe the biggest thing in aviation still will be its impact on climate. And hence, Michael, I'd like to ask, I mean, we heard today from some of the lawmakers, some of the regulators in Europe, that they will increase regulatory pressure on the industry to help Europe achieve its climate goals. So what specifically does it mean for aircraft financing for your industry?
Well, I think there are various channels through which the aircraft industry is affected. First of all, politics and regulators obviously are in a dilemma to some extent, because on the one hand, they of course need the economy to rebound. They especially need those economic sectors most affected by the corona crisis to regain strength and power. And that would mean obviously not to put additional regulatory burdens on them. On the other hand, regulatory pressure will increase in Europe. There's no doubt about that. Regulatory pressure on the aviation industry in general, we have not seen all that much of that in the latest Green Deal, but we will see more pressure in the years coming. But also, and that's relevant as well, regulatory and stakeholder pressure on the financial services industry. We have a massive flood of new regulation. Sustainable finance is the key word for financial services at the moment. There are increasing needs for transparency, for reporting on carbon footprints of our investments, on the carbon footprints of our, so to say, financed emissions, and the pressure on the financial services industry, but also from the financial services industry, will increase. Just to give you one example, Munich Re has joined the so-called Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance at the beginning of this year. This is an alliance of several institutional investors, and the members of that alliance have committed to transition their entire investment portfolio to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050, in line with a temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. That means investors will engage with the companies they invest in all economic sectors, the aircraft industry being one example for that. So we see regulatory pressure increasing, not only on aviation, but also on financial services, which then, of course, also have to look what's in their asset portfolio.
To me, that Corona is maybe a little bit of bad weather, but if I want to be in the industry for the long run, then the rolling thunder that's about to hit me is the regulation that comes with ESG. Joseph, do you agree, and how do you prepare for that?
Yes, it's something that we take very seriously. You can't ignore the ESG parameters that are increasing in importance for the investment community at the moment. We just recently released our 2020 ESG report, and it's one that it's a subject that we've taken much more seriously in the last number of years in terms of publications. It's something that we have taken seriously behind the scenes for many years. But I think, whether it was sustainable investing initially, moving towards kind of ESG related issues today, how that impacts our strategy has to be aligned. So it's no good having an ESG strategy and a company strategy. Both of those strategies must be aligned today, and they must be. You must have conviction for them, and they can't be toothless. You must align them fully. So, from an AerCap perspective, that means having a fleet strategy which aligns to that. So, we have set a target of 2/3 of our portfolio being the latest and most fuel-efficient aircraft by 2021. We're up to 62% at the moment. And that is our way of responding to the climate crisis. We are not developers of aircraft. We are large purchasers of aircraft, and we do work with the original equipment manufacturers, both on the engine side and the airframe side, to try and develop new technologies. But until such time as those technologies are commercially viable, we can only buy the most fuel-efficient aircraft and try and support our airlines around the world in that endeavour. And it is clear that on the investor side, and so what I would describe as the liability side of the business, whether that is financiers or equity investors, your green credentials and your commitment to governance and sustainability has to be aligned, and it has to be serious. And I think that's something that people will demand more and more over in the years to come. So I think from our perspective, we've been doing it for 4 or 5 years. We've been talking about it probably for 2 or 3 years, but it's going to be much clearer to people that it's an integral part of the strategy in the years to come.
Maybe a bit naive and even romantic thought, but I still want to ask Joseph, if you guys don't invest in it, it literally isn't going to fly. So your industry does have a lot of power into helping shove aviation in the right direction, doesn't it?
It does indeed. You know, companies own just under 45% of every commercial aircraft in the world. AerCap itself owns over 1,000 aircraft, which is 5% of the global commercial fleet. So there's no doubt that we have an important voice in this. From our perspective, we do want to see a movement on carbon reduction initiatives. There are things we can do in the meantime that previous speakers are better qualified to talk about, whether that's improved air traffic control, sustainable aviation fuels, or ground handling. It is clear from the normal developments of commercial aviation, whether that's from the recent events in Boeing or Airbus, that the regulation is a very important part of the aviation framework, and that it's a very difficult thing to build an airplane, never mind design a clean sheet one. So first and foremost, it has to be safe, it has to be sustainable, and it has to be economically viable. If all three of those parameters are met, then absolutely the aircraft leasing sector will get behind them and support them, because that is the way of the future.
We're going to leave it there. That was our final panel for today. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Joseph. Now we'll take a tiny break, and then we will wrap things up here. And we have one special treat for you. We call it a graphic recording, an artistic outcome, digital outcome of what we discussed here today. One final remark. We should be saying apologies for one of the panels that you did not witness live. That was about propulsion system. We had some technical glitches. Well, I guess aircraft engine makers know what that means, but we'll be right back after this tiny short break.